Welcome back to the workbench. Matt from Model Minutes here, and today I'm making a start on the M3 Stuart in 1/35 scale from Airfix. This particular one being part of a Commonwealth themed buddy build with two other YouTubers. This is slightly different to my normal build videos, as this one will be in a number of parts, due to the larger scale and slightly more complex build than I'm used to. In this first part, I'm going to focus on the build of the lower hull and interior of the tank. If you'd like to see a more detailed review of the contents of the kit, along with a little more history of the model and the fact that it's not actually an original Airfix tooling, but actually a rebox from Academy, take a look at the unboxing video I made, which you can find on my channel. I'll pop a list of paints and things on screen now so that you can get an idea of the different products I used during this part of the build. Please remember that with any model building activity, the use of sharp tools and toxic paints and chemicals can pose a risk to health and safety. Airfix recommends this kit to those aged 8 years and older. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. Throughout this build, I will either snip the parts from the sprue using my cutters or a sharp knife. I then sand any rough areas of plastic or flash with a sanding stick. Just a small disclaimer here, I'm in no way a tank expert, so I haven't got a clue what some of these parts are going to be called, so bear with me as I fumble through this. Having removed various parts from their sprues, the first assembly is of the numerous bogies which hold the running wheels. I used Revell contactor cement on these two parts to join them together. I then add the wheels to their frames. It's worth noting that the wheels don't have to be glued in, which will allow for them to rotate freely. The two halves of the frames were cemented together to hold them in place. The parts I joined earlier are now also added. I'm pretty sure they form part of the suspension for the bogie. It all starts to make a bit more sense when they're joined together. I repeated this step 3 more times until I had 4 identical assemblies. The larger return wheel is built in a very similar manner, being pressed between its frame halves, which are then glued together. This detailing part gets cemented into its slot in the front. I had to repeat this for the other one, which goes on the other side of the tank. The drive sprockets come in 2 halves which are simply cemented together, making sure they line up with the moulded mounting grooves on each part. Again, I repeated this, so I had 2 of these. And here is the bottom of the hull, which mostly comes in one big part. I cemented the 3 guide rollers onto their locating pins. This was then followed by the drive sprocket. I don't think you're supposed to cement this part on, as it could allow you to rotate the tracks later, but personally I couldn't see it staying on its pin without doing that, so I cemented it on anyway. I then added 2 of the bogies to this side of the hull. This was followed by the return rollers. Everything I've done here would have to be replicated on the other side as well. Here I'm adding some of the smaller details to the rear plate of the tank. The handles for the hatches are glued into their holes. This is then followed by the mounts for the tie-down shackles. This is quite fiddly, so I had to take my time here. The shackles are then cemented onto their mounting points. With that done, this part can be added to the rear of the tank hull. It has moulded location lines on the inside, which makes it quite easy to get it in the right place. This box part, which I'm pretty sure contains a radio, was cemented onto this shelf on the edge of the tank hull. I pretty much had to guess its location here, as there are no moulded locating marks. The ammo racks need to be built, but this is relatively straightforward. The casings get cemented into the upper and lower plates. It was just a little fiddly to get it all lined up. Next, I assembled the transmission and drive shaft casings. These come in a number of parts and simply cement together using the various locating marks and slots to get them in the right places. This interior wall has the ammo rack cemented onto it, with these little legs being added into their slots underneath. It can then be glued onto the deck plate. Again, this has little moulded slots and grooves to help get everything lined up correctly. The drive shaft casing can then be cemented onto the deck and rear wall. The transmission casing needs this circular component added onto it before it is also cemented into place. The seats are glued to their mounting points on the floor of the tank. They come in a couple of parts, with the backrests having to be added separately. Make sure you get these the right way up. These levers were popped into their places here as well. Now let's go back to the hull of the tank. I added the lower hatch component into its hole in the bottom, but it has so much extra plastic on the top which was stopping the internal area from sitting properly. I had to sand this down using my rotary tool. With that done, I used Humbrol liquid poly to cement the interior inside the hull. I used this cement as it doesn't evaporate as quickly as Tamiya Extra Thin, which I normally use, and it is slightly more aggressive, so should form a good bond. The top of the tank hull has this bit of support plastic inside it. I had to cut this out and sand the area down. Now it's time to start painting. I'm using Tamiya XF2 flat white acrylic, which I've thinned with Tamiya X20A acrylic thinners in my airbrush until it was as thin as milk. The instructions indicated that the internal areas were painted with a white colour. Airfix, naturally, suggested Humbrol 34 matte white, but I'm not a fan of that one, so opted for this substitution instead. I will spray all the internal areas with this white, including the lower side of the top of the tank. A number of thin coats would be needed to get a uniform finish. As mentioned earlier, I'm very fortunate that I can afford to get different paints for my various projects, and it's thanks to the people on screen. My patrons over on Patreon and channel members here on YouTube get extra perks and early access to videos, and if you'd like to join them, take a look at the links in the description. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome my newest patrons. They are William, who joins the Recruit tier, and Paul in the Advanced tier. Welcome to the club. Anyway, with the white paint now dry, I used Humbrol 54 bronze metallic enamel paint to pick out the shell cases in the ammo racks. Again, a number of layers of this paint would be needed to cover the white paint. I used a fine brush to do this, and in hindsight, it might have been easier to do this before adding it to the model. Vallejo Model Air Olive Drab was next to be used. Instead of putting it through my airbrush though, I brushed it on by hand to the radio box. Again, a number of layers would be needed. Humbrol 32 dark grey matte acrylic was carefully painted onto the wire cables on the rear bulkhead. Humbrol 26 matte khaki acrylic was thinned with some Tamiya acrylic thinner and then used on the two seats. Again, a couple of thin layers would be needed. There are a number of ammo boxes for the machine guns included. I quickly assembled 5 of these. I got the olive drab out again and then sprayed it onto these boxes. When they were dry, they were cemented onto the shelf on the other side of the tank. Humbrol 174 Signal Red Satin acrylic was thinned with a little acrylic thinner and then carefully painted onto the fire extinguisher component. I would also use Humbrol 11 silver metallic on the metal parts of the extinguisher and 33 matte black on the nozzle. It was then carefully glued into its holes on the side of the transmission shaft casing. I used my homemade black wash to add contrast and shade, bringing out some of those details. It was made from black enamel paint and white spirit, and for more information on how to make and use this wash, take a look at my tutorial video on that topic. When that was dry, Humbrol 11 silver was dry brushed over the internal areas. This is to give a slightly worn appearance, as if the paint has been chipped off in places during use. I thought that as this particular tank had been used in the desert, then sand would be everywhere inside it. So to simulate this, I used some yellow pastel dust and brushed it into the areas I thought the crew could have inadvertently dragged it during their use of the tank. I focused this weathering on some areas more than others. And with that done, I think it's a good place to stop for this first part of my Airfix M3 Stuart build in 1/35 scale. The interior and lower hull of the tank is pretty much complete, and in the next video I'll make more progress on adding details to the top of the tank and start some painting on the outside of the hull. So far, I am enjoying the build. It's nice to make a change from the smaller scales that I work in. With more detail and larger parts, it's certainly easier on the eyes. The parts I've built in this video haven't really presented much of a challenge, but I'm sure as I progress, I will get stretched further, particularly with all those multi-part tracks. I normally wrap up my build videos with a review of the kit and look at its history, but I'll save that for the final part in the series. Being a buddy build though, let's catch up with how the other two YouTubers are getting on with their Commonwealth themed builds. It would seem that Nomad has already finished his Sherman Firefly and it looks absolutely fantastic. Herbert Erpaderp, on the other hand, has made good progress on his Matilda, with the majority of his build looking to be complete and painting due to happen next. Thanks to both Herbert and Nomad for taking part in this build. Seems I've got some catching up to do. Make sure you go check out their channels to see more of their builds and their other videos. I'll add links to their channels in the description, and whilst you're in the description box you'll find links to my social media accounts where you can connect with me as well. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more, make sure you click that like button and subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss the next episode in the series. Finally, a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.